Our world is changing. As educators guide their students into an increasingly diverse global community, the importance of students needing to relate to, study with, and work with people of different linguistic and cultural backgrounds is more critical than ever. World language teachers must ask themselves one crucial question: how can I be more effective and relevant in today's world to help my students develop the skills necessary to succeed? Research suggests that it's not so much what the teacher knows, but what the teacher does in the classroom that maximizes student achievement. The TELL project, or Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning, represents a new vision for learning a language, a vision driven by standards, principles of proficiency, and performance. TELL offers a unique collection of products and processes to facilitate and support any teacher, allowing him or her to self-assess, peer assess, and work with administrators to set goals and track their progress towards professional growth. The TELL project is shaped by a framework of 7 domains that describe the model world language teacher. Each domain is guided by a single essential question educators might ask themselves. Teachers can start their exploration of the domains at any point, personalizing TELL's wide variety of free resources. These tools, which honor every individual's experience, provide all teachers with opportunities for growth. TELL is garnering widespread praise throughout the world language community, suggesting that when world language teachers and TELL work together, they can better reach and prepare world language students for success in the real world. Visit tellproject.org to learn more and access all our free resources.
Okay. Wow, what a great start with Frances this morning. And I knew what she was talking about, but I didn't know exactly where she was going. And it feels like, oh, I could have told that. What a great setup for the focus of my live presentation this morning, because I had this title slide called "Thriving in a Deficit Culture," and now I almost want to change that to "Thriving despite receiving controlling feedback nonstop." But that's essentially what we're going to talk about this morning, was like, what messages are you currently receiving as a teacher from your colleagues, from your administrators, from even your own thinking, and how does that impact what you do in the classroom? So yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to share some new tools from the TELL project that take a little bit of a different spin. So while Florencia was talking all about feedback for students, I'm going to talk about now can we do a better job in giving feedback to teachers, because that's what I work in. I shared this kind of sad, funny, but real screen in a presentation yesterday about what is your goal as a teacher for this year. And I know while the teacher was a little bit frustrated, you can also understand where they're coming from. And we've got to change that. We've got to somehow help teachers thrive in an environment that causes us to post things like that on social media. And to that end, I'm wondering, do teachers really know what they're trying to I shouldn't say that, but what they're trying to, yes, they know what they're trying to do with their kids, so what the end outcome is, but do they really know what they're wanting to do, and do they really know when something amazing happens? That's what I'm wondering, because I think teachers actually do know how to teach, and teachers do amazing thing, but when something amazing happens in a classroom, but you're the only one who sees this, did it really happen? And that's the question that I think we do need to ask ourselves, as so many teachers, especially language teachers, teach in isolation. I think there's a reason why we have so many people signed up for the summit from so many parts of the world who probably don't have anybody else that they can share and talk to things about. So in order for a teacher to know when they're doing something amazing, a couple of things have to happen. They need to be able to observe, name, and complement effective strategies in their practice. That's right. This is all about feedback. This is all about helping teachers understand all the good things that they're already doing, helping them to see what their strengths are. Because I think we spend too much time in education talking about all of our limitations, our weaknesses, all the things that are going bad. Most faculty meetings are focused on all the things that are going wrong with the school, all the things that are going wrong with a group of kids, all the things that are wrong with the parents, all the things that are wrong with our colleagues. And we very rarely help teachers observe, name, or compliment successful things, right? At least that's been my experience. So let's see if we can actually do that. So the first thing we got to do, we have to actually be able to observe effectiveness for language learning. So I shared a little bit yesterday, and you saw another snippet in this session in the beginning, the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning project, which of course allows us to really help find what does effective language learning actually look like. So I want to see if we can do that with those folks who are actually attending live. In the chat, either if you're joining on Facebook or if you're joining on YouTube, could you describe for me a winning moment or event in your own classroom from this past crazy school year? I know it's been perhaps the craziest school year ever, but what is something that you would describe as a winning moment? What was something positive that came out of it? Can you do that? And if you do, I invite you to put your response in the chat because I would love to see what your response to that is. What went really well this year? What is one of those winning moments or winning events that you had with your students or just in your own practice? Something that you've been working towards and then maybe it worked, or something maybe you didn't work towards and it wasn't unplanned or a surprise outcome. Nobody has anything positive happen to them. Oh, I hope you had positive things this year. That's okay. If you're watching this later on replay, just kind of think about this and make a note. What is something really positive that happened in your own practice? Because when we're observing these strengths, there's a couple of tips that I want to share. So um, the first one is we got to change even what we're looking for. Got to look for those bright spots in our community, right? Perhaps you're already journaling, perhaps you're not. I shared yesterday in a different session the idea of using Catalyst as a journal so that you can also document all the things that are going well. When something makes you laugh out loud when you were students, write it down afterwards. What was it? What was the source of that humor so that you can remember it better? And then teachers don't do a good job of this very often, but when students actually do give you a compliment, listen to it really carefully. Which compliments do you hear from students more often? What do your students love about you? Could you answer that question? And when I know the rare times that parents actually express gratitude, listen again carefully. What are your parents or the parents of your students grateful for? How have you served them and their children? And then one of my favorite tips here is when you examine student work, don't just look at did they actually do all the things you asked them to do, did they complete the assignment, but are you looking for evidence of growth? Write down everything, small, large, that you've done to help them get to that point, so that you know why your students are going. I think one of those dangerous things of those effective teachers happens is that they don't know why they're really good. I've been in classrooms of some amazing teachers and they don't know what they're doing and they couldn't even tell you and they don't even think they're doing a good job. And then these last two, I think, are probably the most important ones. Write a thank you note to your future self. I've done this with teachers all the time, but you can post date something or you can schedule yourself an email and write yourself a thank you email right now for the end of the summer or for one at the end of next school year so that you get it and you might surprise yourself. And then if you are on social media, try to find those positive voices on social media instead of, oh wait, all the negativity that we find on social media that can perhaps contribute to us not even be able to observe our own strength. So observing strength is one thing, but then we also have to, the second one was we have to name it. And again, that's where the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning project comes in, and kind of make sure that we actually name behaviors, not buzzwords. And that's really, really hard. I've done this work with teachers now for some time, and they're so used to using all the buzzwords. Oh, if I showed you a video of a classroom right now, what would you say? It's like, oh, well, the kids are very engaged. Well, that's a big buzzword, right? Engagement. What does it really mean? What do you really see? What can you see, or what are you seeing in a video that makes you think the students are engaged? What do you see in the kids' faces? What you can hear in the kids' voices? What you can see them doing? Why are they truly engaged? Or are we just using the buzzwords? Are you really good at, I don't know, whatever the buzzword happens to be? Higher order thinking, right? That's always a good one. Can you really see higher order thinking? But what are the behaviors that you are doing in your class that's causing that to happen? Or what, more importantly, what are your students exhibiting that causes anybody to think that there's actually higher order thinking going on in that class? So again, when we're defining behaviors, we got to focus on, when we're defining effectiveness, when we're naming strength, we got to focus on teacher behaviors, not just on buzzwords that we hear in personal development or in even our literature that's filled with buzzwords all the time. So to help you with that, there's a couple of reflection questions that I've adapted from Beferde that I think might help you with that process. So how are you using your, once you've found that practice that you think you're really good at, right? We've named it, we found it. How are you using that to build on that practice in your classroom? How are you using that to get better at something else? How do you know? The scary thing is in teaching, if you're trying to do something, let's say you've been working all year long on trying to stay in a target language, I don't know, whatever, 90% of the time. It turns out the sky doesn't just open up and goes, hallelujah, today you have married, you have talked 90% of target language. It doesn't work that way, right? So we've got to know when that happens. How will you know when you've reached a certain goal or that you were working towards? What was that moment? So that you know when it happens. And certainly there's tools from the TELL framework and within Catalyst that can help you make that happen. Once you've identified your own strength, what are some other teachers in your community, either in your building or in your virtual professional community? Who else is doing really well with that? Who's having success? And maybe they're successful, but maybe they're successful for a different way. What can you learn from them? There isn't just one way of doing it, right? Maybe once you know that you're really good at one thing and you can find other people who are also really good at that, you can find out why they're good at it. And then you can get even better at that particular practice. Again, strength can also be professional goals. It doesn't always have to be a deficit that has to be that can function as a professional goal. We can also use strength to continue building on wanting to maintain what we've already identified as the strength of your practice. And then so you may think that's a strength, but what have your students said about that? What have they given you any kind of positive feedback about this key practice? Maybe you think you're really good at something. How do they feel about this? Maybe you think you are awesome in using music, but maybe the kids hate it when you sing those silly songs. Maybe they're thinking it doesn't help them at all, but they just let you do it because it's silly and, it's kind of fun to see you making a fool of yourself. Not that there's anything wrong with using music, but how do you know? Have you asked your students? Some of my teachers always put at the end of any kind of unit assessment this little section like, which strategies, which activities in the past 4 weeks helped you be successful on this performance assessment? Because they wanted to know, they wanted to find out what helped them actually get better. I might think I'm really good at this, and I think the kids were engaged, quote unquote, right, buzzword. Maybe they even had fun, but did it actually help them get better as a language learner? Or was it just something we did one day? Because if you don't, you're going to keep doing it thinking that is the right strategy, that's the right activity, and maybe it doesn't actually help the kids grow. So to help you with that kind of process, the TEL framework has now created a series of documents we're calling learner pathways. The idea here is to bring in a little bit of the student voice into professional development. So much of professional development um, about many of these sessions are focused on what should you do as a teacher. In fact, the entire teacher TEL framework is focused on teacher practices, teacher behaviors. And sometimes I'm wondering, have we left out the most important part of the conversation, that is the learners? So we want to talk a little bit about what does it mean for a learner to experience all those practices that we're saying are really good for teachers, right? What are they? What happens? What happens to students when you do all of those things? And that's what the learner pathway is all about. So they're kind of flipping the entire conversation and put the onus on, not the onus on, but starting with the student experience. Because we always think about, when we talk about student experience, we know what we want them to do, again, language wise, and we think that is the goal. Eh, kind of. I mean, that's almost a given, right? But what are they experiencing? What is helping them grow as a language learner? So again, we have identified a series of learner experiences, something that happens to students in a language classroom. And we want to be very um, explicit about that. So saying what happens to a student in the classroom, and then figure out, okay, if we want students to experience that, here are the things that we have to do as a teacher. Do you see how that changes the conversation? Because so often it's like, well, teachers, if you just do X, Y, and Z, then your students will be able to do that. Well, what if we flip it around and we're saying, if we want our students to be able to do that, and I'm not talking about language can-dos or language outcomes, I'm talking about certain practices, certain behaviors, certain experiences that we want them to have in a language classroom, then we as a teacher have to do the following things. So again, it's flipping the TEL framework upside down on its head. So here you can see one example of what these learner experiences could look like. This one is, I believe, from the moving from input to output. And each of these learner pathways identifies 3 learner behaviors. So these are things that we hope students are experiencing. So it's no longer about, oh, the teacher must use the target language 90% of the time. Oh, the teacher should use authentic resources. Oh, the teacher should check for understanding. Now, it's about these 3 things. It's about that the learners are immersed in a language-rich environment, right? It's about learners having time to actually process all that input that they're receiving before they're ever being asked to produce. And then eventually, that learner are engaged in activities that actually require them to use the language in a meaningful context. So these are 3 things that we want students to be able, learners to be able to experience. And if we agree on those, we can say, okay, these are 3 really important things. Then we can figure out, okay, so what do I now have to do as a teacher to make that happen? Oops, wrong one. Here we go. So if we take then one of these learning experiences, we can then align all the different behaviors that the TEL framework identifies and is essentially a guide for teachers that they would have to do in order for that learner experience to happen for a student. So do you see how that completely changes the lens on professional development? Instead of just focusing on, well, if you do this, your students will be better speakers. No, we're going to talk about, if we want our students to experience this kind of classroom, here are the things that we would have to do. And we have identified what we thought were hot button issues for many, many teachers. So we started with the following learner pathways. There's one on learning targets and checks for learning, and how do those two connect. There's one on creating a learning cycle. How do you actually sequence activities? There's the one we just kind of looked at a little bit more detail about moving from input to output. There's one on using performance assessments, and not just performance assessments, but if our goal is for them to be successful in performance assessments, what are all the things they have to experience before they ever get there, right? Because it's not something you can just teach, and then you give them performance assessment, but other things have to happen before. We have identified those experiences for the students and then match the appropriate tell subcriteria that say the teacher has to do to cause that to happen. There's one on, not surprisingly, use of the target language. And those are just the first few that we have developed. And I'm wondering, of course, what are some other hot button issues that we do? Based on what I just heard friends to talk about, we might want to have to do one on feedback, because again, she made some really important points, but they were from the teacher perspective. So I wonder if we can turn that around. It's like, if we want students to actually receive the feedback, if we actually want students to respond to the feedback, if we want students to actually use the feedback to grow, what has to happen? So if we can identify those experiences, then we'll be able to find those criteria or behaviors in the TEL framework to help a teacher realize that and make that happen in their classroom. So yeah, so if you have ideas for other pathway topics, do let us know, and we can certainly develop those. But those are the first few that we have released. They're now available on the PEARLL website at PEARLL, PEARLL .nflc.umd.edu. If you click on the teacher effectiveness button, you'll see a link for the new teacher pathways, and that is just the beginning of more to come around those pathways for sure. We have a few other things planned. Oh, I did have these slides. See, I knew I had a slide with the URL. So there you go. So that's the newest tool from PEARLL and the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning project. I hope you find it useful. It's our hope that it will change the conversations for you and the teachers that you work with. We hope that will help you do those three things that I named in the beginning, which was name, observe, and complement your practices. Because I truly believe if we can change our conversation and focus them much more on strength of all the wonderful things that teachers are doing, we might be able to heal our profession by itself, because there's enough negative input from the outside, but we're often not very kind to each other. We're not kind to each other in online conversations. We're not kind to each other sometimes in reactions to presentations. We're not kind to each other in articles. And I think we ought to be much kinder, because there's amazing things happening in language classrooms all across the country. So thank you very much. And I hope you find it useful. Again, let us know what other topics you want us to talk about, and we will definitely do that.